Welcome to all of you. This is the fourth of the online art history talks that I'm doing, and this week we're taking a look at the incredible painting of Guernica by Pablo Picasso. And here we see the picture, which is the first thing to say is the huge size of Guernica. So this is a painting which is, here's my pointing device, everybody, almost 26 feet across, and it's 11.5 feet tall. So in other words, it's designed for a public space. It's in a museum at the moment in Madrid, but it was designed for an art exhibition originally. And one thing I suppose we could say from the start is that people that perhaps don't know the work of Pablo Picasso, they often look at this and say, why is everything so babyish? Why the figures look like they're in a comic book? And so the first few images that I'll show to you will be images from Picasso's early life when he was a child. And we can see actually what an incredibly talented draftsman he was. So let's take a look at some of these. This is a drawing that Picasso did when he was only 12 years old. It's really incredible. So we can see that it's a piece of classical sculpture that he's copied. And if we look at the bottom right here, we can see he signed it. And he signed it Pablo Ruiz, because Ruiz is actually his father's last name. But he ends up taking his mother's last name, and her name is Picasso. But I think everyone can agree that this is an astonishing drawing for anybody, let alone a 12-year-old. I've recently seen this drawing. In fact, it was in an exhibition of Picasso's drawings at the Royal Academy in London just before the lockdown started. So it is extraordinary. It's in very good condition as well. Even more amazing is the next image, and this is an image of the artist's mother, Aunt Pepper. And he does this when he's only 14 years old. This beautiful painting is in the museum, the Picasso Museum in Barcelona. And we can see the face. It's clearly been influenced by the great Diego Velázquez. Of course, we looked at him in last week's online talk. So this is an astonishing painting from anybody, but again, just to say that it's a 14-year-old that's painted this. Science and Charity, this is in the same museum, and he's painted this when he's 15 years old. So these incredible naturalist style pictures from when he was a child are all in the museum. This is a pastel image of his mother, and he does this when he's 16 years old. And this again is in the museum in Barcelona, and it's a beautiful image of his mother. An example of how incredibly talented the artist was. Picasso moves to Paris in 1900, and Paris is the sort of art capital of Europe at this point. And many of the famous artists are living there. So, for example, Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, they're all there. Also, Salvador Dali arrives, and Picasso goes to live. And they live up in Montmartre, which is the hill above Paris. One of the reasons, of course, why all the artists live up in Montmartre is it never used to be part of the city. It was outside the city limits. It was therefore exempt from the city's alcohol tax. So this picture dates from 1907, and it's called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which means the girls of Avignon. Not actually the town of Avignon in Provence in France, but Avignon Street in Barcelona, where there's a brothel. So Picasso's family moved to Barcelona when he's about 14, just after the death of his sister, in fact. And so this image, initially people find incredibly shocking. Even his friends and supporters, his contemporary, who's a little bit older than him, but Henri Matisse, suggests that it's a vile painting. and it doesn't see the light of day for 9 years, so he doesn't actually show it to anybody. It's painted in 1907, and it's 9 years later before it. But it's the picture becomes extremely influential. It's often described as a precursor to Cubism, which is the style of painting that he invented. Cubism becomes very important because it leads on to many other different artistic movements. But Picasso is not only the inventor of Cubism, but he's the inventor of composite sculpture, collage, and all sorts of things. So the reason why people didn't like this painting is because of the aggressive, menacing look of these girls who are naked and thrusting their bodies at the viewer. He'd been influenced by what he'd seen from African tribal masks from the Paris Ethnographic Museum, and that's clearly evident from the two figures over on the right. And the harsh angularity of the figures is something that people felt he'd taken too far. It had gone to unnecessary extremes. The picture today is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and is an incredible picture to see. So when lockdown is over, I recommend a visit. The amazing painting. This is just I'm showing you here an image of the centre of Paris, so many of you probably know it. But just to familiarise ourselves with the centre of Paris, and the reason for showing you this map is to show you where Picasso lived in Paris in the 1930s. So down here, this is the Élysée Palace where the French president lives. This is the famous Champs-Élysées street, the bottom of it actually. The Arc de Triomphe is at the other end up north, like it's basically off the map. Over here is the Paris Opera. This is Saint-Lazare train station. And this is Picasso's house here. He lives in a street called Rue La Boétie, number 23 in fact. And it's not that far away from where he gets a studio. This is another image. This is obviously Notre Dame. And he lives over on the left bank. He finds a studio in this street here. It's Rue de Grande Augustine. And it's at number 7, just at this intersection here. And when he's not in the studio, he spends a lot of his time here at the Café de Flore, which is on Boulevard Saint-Germain. And that actually becomes almost an overflow of his studio. He's at this cafe every day. The studio is useful though for him. It's behind. This is the street in Paris today, and there's a plaque here on the wall that shows us that Guernica was painted here. Picasso at the time was the most famous artist in the world, and when Guernica is painted, he's in his mid-50s already. So he's already been through half of his career, I suppose. But he is recognised on the street, and so he wants to find a studio that he can be by himself away from everybody. And at the beginning of 1937, he gets a visit from representatives of the Spanish Republican government. So at the time, Spain has gone through terrible political instability. And the reason for that is that the monarch has been deposed. And in the monarch's place is a government made up of left-wing intellectuals, union leaders, communists, the Republican government is not universally popular. And the year before, in 1936, is the start of the Spanish Civil War, which lasts for 3 years. And so the leaders of the Republican government, they travel to Paris because there is an exhibition where they're going to be represented in Paris in 1937. And they've asked the most famous artist in the world, Pablo Picasso, for a public commission as a contribution towards this exhibition. Now, Picasso hates these sorts of commissions and generally says no to them. But in this particular case, he feels that kind of nostalgia for his homeland and reluctantly agrees to become involved. But he can't find any source of inspiration for what the public commission will be. In the north of Spain, in the Basque country, a terrible incident occurs on the 26th of April 1937, and it's the bombing of a small town called Guernica. And it's organised by the people who are opposed to the Republican government. That's the nationalists under General Franco. And Franco has made an arrangement with Nazi Germany and also Fascist Italy as a kind of practice run for what was going to happen from the aerial bombardment of the various air forces in the Second World War. So it's a precursor. And at this time, of course, the 1930s, aerial warfare is brand new and everyone is terrified of what it entails. And so they go on a practice run and do a bombing of Guernica at 4:30 in the afternoon. It's market day, everyone is in the street, and the place is absolutely shredded. Hundreds of people die. The number of people who did die is perhaps exaggerated in later news reports, but it's reckoned to be several hundred people. It's considered an absolute slaughter. News reaches Paris by the 1st of May, and it comes in the form of a brilliant piece of journalism by a journalist called George Steer from the Times of London, who writes a piece that becomes very well known. It's explained to Picasso what's happened, and almost straight away he decides that this will be his subject matter for the public commission. This then, everyone, is a series of images that he starts drawing. And we can see the date here. This is the 1st of May 1937. And this is the second drawing that he makes for preparation of Guernica. And his working methods were actually arranged by his then girlfriend and collaborator, Henrietta Theodora Markovich. We know her as Dora Maar, the photographer. Here is another image. He worked quite a lot in colour in preparation for Guernica. We can see the date here at the top, 3rd of June. But the final image ends up being black and white, and there's a good reason for that, because black and white is the medium that he's found the story, because that's the medium of journalism. And we now see a series of photographs of Guernica's development in his studio. So this massive piece of canvas, which is almost 26 feet across, and we can see the development here. But there are changes, of course, because the final painting, the bull, is the other way around, facing over to the left. This image here disappears, and then the general muddle over here is cleared up too, so he simplifies it, but certain of these images here remain the same in the finished version of the picture. Here we can see the picture developing. When it ended up in the museum in Madrid in 1981, finally, extensive analysis was done on the painting to discover that actually the priming layer, so the base layer of the painting, if you like, was a white lead and also graphite, which is like a kind of crushed glass combination. So the white sections of the painting are quite luminous, but the black paint is matte black, so it's a curious mixture of materials that he's used here. But certainly the priming layer is very old-fashioned. Even sort of Middle Ages images would have had it would have been primed in a similar way. This is Picasso working on the painting, and we can see him on the stepladder here. And one presumes that the painting is in its latter stages of completion here. And then finally we get to the image itself. So a lot of people, when they look at Guernica, are confused by what is going on, and it's difficult to make out in certain regard what is going on. So let's try and go through this bit by bit. Over on the left is the bull, and the bull is the only figure that is looking at us, looking at the viewer. The bull, of course, figures in Spanish culture extensively because of bullfighting, and Picasso portrayed himself as a bull quite frequently. And so it could be that he's portraying himself as the viewer here, but also the bull could represent dark forces. Maybe it's a version of what he. Maybe the bull represents the bombers, or maybe it's General Franco. And just below we see this terrifying image here of the screaming mother with the dead baby. We see a soldier here, a dead soldier with his arm outstretched. And he's been decapitated, you can see that. And also his arm has been chopped off as well. We see a broken sword here. The broken sword perhaps represents the broken will of the people. But there's a sense of hope as well, because there we see a growing flower. We see a figure over on the right. A woman has come out of her home in terrific confusion. The sound, the terrible noise, maybe her house has been destroyed. Out into the street, we can see there's a kind of pyramid created of light from two different sources. One here is a lamp, a figure of a face coming through the window, and her arm is carrying the lamp here. Many art historians, the hugely distinguished art historian John Richardson, who wrote the several different biographies of Picasso, believe that this figure coming through the window represents Picasso's dead sister Conchita, who dies of diphtheria when Picasso is only 14 years old. And Conchita appears in other images painted and drawn by Picasso during this period, so it's possible that this is a representation of her. We see the light bulb in the middle of the picture here. And one of the reasons why the light bulb might be there is because in Picasso's studio in Paris, the light bulb above the canvas keeps on exploding, which causes him terrific anxiety, although Dora Maar keeps on laughing at him. But of course, in Spanish, I'm no expert in Spanish language, but the word for light bulb is bombilla. It's like a nickname, I think, for a light bulb. Similar, of course, to the word for bomb. We see a horse here in the middle of this picture has received a terrible injury. It has a sword or some kind of very sharp stick going all the way through the middle of its body, and it's screaming in agony. So why is a horse in the middle of a bombing of a market town? Well, for a couple of reasons. There were, of course, many animals that were killed on that day. So that's one possibility. Another one is that the horse was used extensively in Spanish bullfighting. And when Picasso was a child, the horse would have no protection. And so the terrified horse would frequently get gored and dismembered by the bull. These days, of course, during bullfights, the horse does receive protection. And then over on the right-hand side, we see this figure trapped in the flames that are emerging from the building here. And again, this terrifying image on the face. So, when the picture was finished, it was done remarkably in only 34 days. So from the first time that he actually started sketching to the finished painting itself was only a period of 34 days. And when it went on exhibition for the first time in Paris, people were very surprised at what they saw. And the Republican government representatives from Spain did not like it at all and felt quite embarrassed about the fact that this horrible picture from the most famous artist in the world, they wanted something perhaps a bit more like this. This is by one of Picasso's contemporaries, and this painting was in the same exhibition. And this image, of course, is of the women screaming up at the skies. But there is nothing in this painting to suggest that it relates to Guernica itself. And that's one of the problems with it, as far as the people at the time are concerned. Ironically, though, the fact that there is no direct reference to Guernica itself takes the painting into a different dimension for the rest of its life. And so it becomes, after the end of World War II, the painting becomes a real poster, I suppose, for war protest, particularly during the time of the Vietnam War, because the painting ends up going to New York at the start of World War II to protect it. And many artists from Europe go to New York to spend the duration of the war in New York. The arrival of Guernica in New York actually is the start of a kind of shift of the balance of power in the global art movement. This image is in the former Whitechapel Gallery in East London. So first Guernica goes to Burlington House, like the Royal Academy, but then it goes to the East End of London to Whitechapel. And this is Clement Attlee, who's the leader of the British Labour Party, and he's opening the exhibition where Guernica is. This is Roland Penrose, over on the right-hand side, the friend of Picasso, who has organised this exhibition. And he is criticised by Picasso in the end because the painting is quite badly treated when it leaves London. It goes up to Manchester. And this image here is this organisation of people was sending a relief ship to people in Spain who had suffered during the Spanish Civil War. So it says here in this paragraph that the artist Picasso was actually in Guernica at the time of its bombardment, which is not true, of course, because he was painting the picture. So when the picture arrives in New York, many of the artists in the United States are hugely influenced by Picasso. Picasso is the most famous artist in the world at this point. And this is a sketch done by Jackson Pollock, the painter who becomes very well known for his action painting. And he goes to see Guernica on exhibition in the Museum of Modern Art in New York many different times. He goes by himself, and he ends up in a punch-up with one person who is criticising the painting, gets this person outside and beats him up. But we can see the image of the screaming face, and Pollock, of course, ends up quite quickly working abstract painting. But here, of course, he's still sketching. This is 1939 when this drawing is done. Guernica becomes, as I said a couple of minutes ago, very important for protest movements, none more so than during the time of the Vietnam War. So an example of what I mean is these sorts of posters became very important as a form of protest. And here the picture has been abused. It's had "kill, lies, all" defaced on it, and this is in 1974 at the end of the Vietnam War. But during the war, there was a sort of vigil of students that used to congregate in the gallery every day because, of course, Guernica represented that anti-war protest image. But also at the same time, groups of artists and the general public had written to Picasso to actually have Guernica taken out of the Museum of Modern Art, because it felt that the picture being there, that Picasso himself was complicit with the American governments fighting the war in Vietnam. And so Picasso probably ignored this, but at the time he found himself in a very complicated position. So this defacing of the painting happened on a strange day, the day that the only person who was implicated and tried for a massacre called the My Lai massacre in the middle of the Vietnam War. When that soldier was released from jail is the day that this defacing of Guernica occurred. It didn't take them long to clean off this spray paint because it didn't go below the varnish layer which is on top of the image. But certainly from this point onwards, Guernica becomes a very sort of powerful anti-war protest image from that point forward. This is an image of Guernica on a Czechoslovakian stamp, which when it's sent into Spain, General Franco refuses any mail or parcels with this postage stamp to come into Spain. It just shows you what a bit of a mess he got himself into with Picasso, who was a constant critic of the military dictatorship in Spain. But nevertheless, by the end of the 1960s, the nationalists and Franco tried to make peace with Picasso by suggesting that the painting comes to Spain. Picasso had refused this request and ends up drawing up a document with his lawyer in New York to say that the painting should only ever go to Spain in the future if Spain becomes a republic again. So its intention is made clear, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York is put on notice that maybe, hopefully, one day the picture will end up going back to Spain. And so we can see that the painting, of course, does end up back in Spain. Franco dies in 1975, and negotiations are held over the next 5 or 6 years with the help of the new Spanish government, and finally the picture returns. And it's hard to think of any other painting in art history which is instrumental in a country moving from a dictatorship into democracy. But that's the position that Guernica finds itself in. So it's arguable that the painting is much more famous than any other painting in art history, even Mona Lisa, because of course there are millions of people that know of this image who may not necessarily be interested in Picasso or modern art, but they may very well know about Guernica. And of course, this is the Security Council in New York, and this is a tapestry which was made of Guernica, and it was commissioned by Nelson Rockefeller, who was the vice president under Gerald Ford, for those of you that remember that time. And this is actually in the Security Council chamber. Not least, this is it's interesting to look at this because we get a true sense of the massive scale of the picture. And it's always stood here again as this famous anti-war protest image, which becomes in 2003, when the American government, Colin Powell, goes into the building to make a speech at the start of the second Iraq War. But Guernica is covered up with a blue curtain, and so it becomes a sort of even more powerful, the fact that it's covered up, and it becomes this big news story. Why was Guernica covered when Powell was speaking? And the TV cameras are angled so they're not really even showing the curtain. But behind him, of course, it was drawn. So that is today the Security Council building. And this is Guernica, the town of Guernica in northern Spain today. And this is a mural in a garden that commemorates the painting. And they really quite want the painting back. It's not that far away. I mean, the picture is in the Modern Art Museum in Madrid, named after the former queen. So it's called the Reina Sofia Museum. And this painting, of course, now it permanently resides in the museum, which some people at the time when it moved to the museum in 1992, and many people felt this was quite contentious because it was clearly written in Picasso's will that the picture should be in the Prado. But the modern art collection of Spain was transferred over to this new museum, and Guernica went with it, where Still today, it's there. It's always protected by two members of staff that are always with the painting. And this garden here up in Guernica commemorates the fact that this famous image by Picasso represents the history of the town. The amazing Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao would certainly like to have the painting, but I don't think that's going to happen. It will probably always stay in Madrid. And so there we have a quick overview of this immensely powerful image. To go to the gallery today, which is highly recommended to a visit to go and see the painting. It still holds an immense power, and it's a great painting. So I would unequivocally encourage anyone to go and see it. So I very much hope you've enjoyed this talk. This is the end of my talk on Picasso's Guernica. Thank you.